Utilizing the strength and speed of the U.S. Navy, the Americans were able to quickly deploy U.S. Marines and Army forces on the hundreds of islands under Japanese control across the South Pacific. The strategy worked well, keeping the Japanese forces under constant threat of attack and slowly choking their ability to reinforce and supply important islands. The Japanese were often forced to take shelter and fight for every square inch of ground, without hope of reprieve or escape. Over the course of 2 years, beginning in the fall of 1942, the U.S. Armed Forces fought brutal campaigns at Guadalcanal, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, and many others. In Europe, with the fall of Italy, the U.S. and the Allies turned their attention to liberating France from Nazi control. On the other side of the European continent, the Soviet Union had at long last repulsed the German invasion of their homeland, and were steadily pushing the Nazis back toward Germany. Seizing on the opportunity, American and British strategists planned for an audacious amphibious assault on the Normandy beaches in the north of France. Under the direction of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allied forces launched Operation Neptune, more popularly known as D-Day, on June 6, 1944. Like Operation Torch in North Africa, D-Day was a multinational assault and included most of the Allied powers, with significant contributions from American, British, Canadian, Australian, and French forces. Undoubtedly one of the most well-known moments of the Second World War, D-Day represented the pinnacle of Allied cooperation and marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Germany and the Axis powers. It did not take long for the German occupation of France to collapse under the weight of the Allied liberation following D-Day. By the winter of 1944, Allied forces had pushed the Nazi troops to the border of France and Germany and prepared for winter engagements through the Ardennes forest. As the Soviets continued their relentless assault in the east, Hitler diverted critical military assets west, hoping to take the Allies by surprise. In December 1944, German forces launched what would be their final offensive of the war through the Ardennes. The assault was initially successful, pushing Allied forces back. Fortunately, Allied air superiority slowed the Nazi advance and ground it to a halt. When the offensive finally ended, the Germans had successfully nearly encircled a large pocket of U.S. troops and dug in for the winter. In what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, American forces endured relentless artillery bombardments, surprise attacks, and unforgiving weather conditions, but never gave up. When German forces demanded the American troops to surrender, their commanding officer allegedly replied with a single phrase, "Nuts." When spring came, so too did the Allied air support, and Germans were quickly pushed away, and the pocket was relieved. With their resources exhausted, their troops surrendering in droves, and Allied forces pushing in from both east and west, Germany was at last close to surrender. It would take a few more months of fierce fighting until the Soviet troops reached Berlin. Hitler committed suicide, and the pre-Nazi German government was restored as the war in Europe at last came to an end. In the Pacific, island after island fell to the U.S. advance. By the spring of 1945, the U.S. was preparing for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, a prospect that was not relished by the military or government alike. In April 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly, leaving the office to his vice president, Harry Truman. Truman was immediately informed of a top-secret program which had been experimenting with the creation of an atomic weapon called the Manhattan Project. Led by physicist Robert Oppenheimer, the project had brought together leading scientific minds from across the United States and beyond to develop an atomic weapon capable of ending the war. When Truman inherited the presidency, he inherited the decision to use the bomb. Faced with a Japanese government unwilling to surrender and what would likely be an incredibly costly series of ground invasions, Truman greenlit the use of the bombs as a way to avoid massive casualties. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the United States dropped Little Boy, an enriched uranium bomb, on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It exploded roughly a mile above the city with the force of 15 kilotons of TNT. The initial blast destroyed everything within a mile of the bomb's detonation, with the exception of a few earthquake-resistant concrete structures. The 1,200-foot or 370-meter fireball produced by the explosion gave off a blinding flash of light and reached temperatures of 6,000 Celsius or 10,830 degrees Fahrenheit, the same as the surface of the sun. Individuals near the center of the blast were instantly vaporized, leaving behind only their shadows on the bleached white stone. The fireball reached roughly 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers in diameter, consuming everything in its path. The devastation caused by the bombing caused roughly 60% of the casualties, with the remaining losses attributed to injuries sustained and to the radiation which spread from the explosion site. Roughly 80,000 to 140,000 civilians and military personnel were killed as a result of the bombing. As word of the full extent of the damage began to spread, the US government again entreated the Japanese to surrender, threatening to drop yet another atomic weapon if they did not. Again, the Japanese government refused, and a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th. Fat Man, a plutonium bomb, was dropped at 11:01 a.m. over Nagasaki's Industrial Valley, and detonated 47 seconds later at 11:02. Fat Man exploded with the force of 21 kilotons of TNT, 40% more than Little Boy had. However, due to weather conditions, the bombardiers had dropped the bomb further away from their intended target, causing much of the explosion to be contained by the mountains surrounding the industrial district. Like the bombing of Hiroshima, the blast and subsequent fireball consumed everything within the blast zone and caused the majority of casualties. Between 60,000 and 80,000 people were killed as a result of the bombing, with hundreds of thousands wounded. In total, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki took the lives of an estimated 129,000 to 226,000 individuals, the vast majority of whom were civilians. On August 10th, the Japanese government signaled their willingness to surrender if their government could remain intact. The United States answered that the terms would be discussed after the Japanese formally surrendered. A brief military coup was attempted on the evening of August 14th by factions within the government who wished to fight to the bitter end. However, it was quickly put down by the Japanese government. The following morning, the Emperor of Japan issued a formal statement of surrender. The Second World War had finally come to an end. More than 16 million men and women served in the U.S. Armed Forces over the course of the war, and some 420,000 Americans had given their lives to help liberate the free world. In doing so, the United States had left its position on isolation behind and entered a new age of globalism. The United States was now a world power and held much of the responsibility of what would come next in its hands. While their alliance with the Soviet Union during the war had been one of necessity, relations had deteriorated even before the war had come to an end. Worse, with the unleashing of atomic weaponry, the United States had unwittingly brought on a new age of warfare and technology, one that would define the decades to follow. Despite fighting together against Nazi Germany in World War II, the US and the Soviet Union were never truly friendly. The US was wary of the Soviets' communist system of government and the atrocities committed by leader Joseph Stalin, while the Soviets were angry that the US wanted to keep them from being a leader in the international community. While these grievances were fiercely held, the conflict that became the Cold War never developed into violence because of the threat of atomic weapons. The US adopted a policy known as containment, which referred to stopping Russia's attempts to expand their reach and influence throughout the world. This strategy provided the rationale for never-before-seen arms buildup in the US. The end of World War II had been hastened by atomic bombs dropped on Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Demonstrating the US's power with a new class of weapons. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its first nuclear weapon, heating up the rivalry. They were racing to develop even more powerful weapons, the hydrogen bomb. In late 1952, the US detonated a hydrogen bomb in the Marshall Islands as a test, resulting in an explosion hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs dropped in Japan. The Soviet Union followed suit with its own test in Kazakhstan in 1955. These tests resulted in devastating health effects for nearby residents in both locations. Nevertheless, testing only ramped up in 1958, during which the US, the Soviets, and the United Kingdom detonated more than 100 bombs worldwide. Following this, the three countries voluntarily paused testing. The Cold War affected American life in a variety of ways. Fears of nuclear warfare inspired drills in schools and people to build bomb shelters in their backyards. Perhaps most destructively, fears of communist sympathy within the US inspired the government to form the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, which was tasked with carrying out investigations of suspected communists. Thousands of federal employees were investigated, many were fired, and some were even prosecuted. Liberal college professors lost their jobs, were forced to testify against colleagues, and others forced to take loyalty oaths. In Hollywood, hundreds of people were investigated, and more than 500 movie industry professionals lost their jobs for having liberal beliefs. Many of these blacklisted writers, directors, actors, and others were unable to work again for more than a decade. This period became known as the Red Scare and is also referred to as McCarthyism after Senator Joseph McCarthy, a vehemently anti-communist politician who led the efforts. Another key symbol of the Cold War was the Berlin Wall, built in 1961 between the communist East German and capitalist West German parts of the city. Though the communist government claimed its purpose was to keep these so-called Western fascists out of East Germany, the wall really functioned to stop mass defections from East to West. It was also a solution to the Berlin crisis of 1958, when Khrushchev demanded the Allies give up West Berlin, which they had taken after World War II ended in 1945. Tensions were high between the Westerners and Soviet-backed Easterners even after the wall was constructed. West Berlin grew prosperous, in great contrast to the poverty of the surrounding East German territory. The wall between them soon became an iconic image of the Cold War in Europe. The impact of the Cold War on daily life was particularly felt during the nearly 2-week conflict that came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, when many Americans thought the world was on the brink of an all-out nuclear war. The country's standoff nearly tipped into conflict in October 1962 when U.S. spy planes discovered secret Soviet missile bases being constructed in Cuba, just 90 miles from U.S. shores. Just a year earlier, in 1961, the U.S. had mounted the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion to try to depose Cuba's Soviet sympathetic leader, Fidel Castro. During the 13-day standoff, U.S. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba and publicly announced the U.S. was ready to use military force to neutralize the threat. But the crisis was resolved when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles in exchange for the U.S. vowing not to invade Cuba and removing missiles it had secretly placed in Turkey to target Russia. The event sobered both the USSR and the U.S., and the following year, a direct hotline was installed between Washington and Moscow to help defuse similar situations. The two countries, along with the United Kingdom, signed a treaty in 1963 agreeing to ban several types of nuclear testing. The Cold War's anti-communist agenda led the U.S. to various other conflicts abroad in its attempts to support democratic governments and depose communist ones. In June 1950, the Soviet-backed North Korean People's Army invaded pro-Western South Korea. Many American officials feared that this was the first step in a communist campaign to take over the world, and that intervening was their duty in a fight of good versus evil. U.S. President Harry Truman sent troops to Korea, but fighting stalled and casualties mounted in a stalemate of skirmishes across the border. Nearly 5 million people died. more than half of them civilians, which is a civilian casualty rate worse than those of World War II or the later Vietnam War. About 40,000 Americans died in action, and 100,000 were wounded. After more than 2 years of negotiations, the adversaries signed an armistice on July 27, 1953. Then, when the French colonial regime in Vietnam fell to communists in 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower called for American intervention under the domino theory, which held that allowing a communist government to keep power in one nation would lead to communist takeovers in neighboring nations, with each falling to communism like a row of dominoes. However, what was intended as a brief military venture spiraled into a bloody, unpopular, and unsuccessful 10-year conflict in Vietnam. While remaining staunchly anti-communist, upon taking office in 1969, U.S. President Richard Nixon immediately tried to soften U.S. relations with the Soviets and dial back the Cold War via diplomacy. In 1972, the US and the Soviet Union agreed to limit the number of nuclear missiles in their arsenals. But the conflict revved up again under President Ronald Reagan, who wanted to provide financial and military aid to those fighting communism around the world, particularly in Central America. The Cold War only came to an end with the Soviet Union's unraveling under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, whose government reforms caused power to shift in the communist bloc. Communist regimes began to collapse in Eastern Europe under the waning Soviet influence, and democratic governments rose in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Then, West and East Germany were reunified in 1989. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991, bringing the Cold War to a close. While the Declaration of Independence may have declared that all men are created equal, the institution of slavery and persistence of bigotry throughout American history meant African Americans faced an uphill battle to make that Declaration of Equality feel true. Despite slavery being abolished in 1865, and the addition of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution in 1868 and 1870, which strengthened the legal rights of freed slaves, the fact that slavery had been the law of the land for nearly 100 years cast a long shadow. Legalized segregation policies, as well as everyday racism and bigotry, meant that in many places, black people and white people were not allowed to occupy the same public spaces, such as buses, restrooms, hospitals, prisons, and schools. At the turn of the century, conservative Democrats in the South passed policies that disenfranchised African Americans further through various social, economic, and political means, such as being prevented from voting, sometimes through violent means. These practices were further entrenched in 1896 by the Supreme Court in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the court ruled against a black man, Homer Plessy, who was protesting his arrest for refusing to give up his seat to a white man on a train in New Orleans, which was required by Louisiana state law. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane, the court wrote in its decision. The court continued to apply this logic to its decisions on matters of segregation in the years that followed, upholding laws that established different rules for blacks and whites, laws which were known as Jim Crow, a derisive term for a black man. Not all of segregation was attributable to laws, however. Discriminatory customs, such as barring black people from certain jobs, housing developments, or stores, were also commonplace. Throughout these years, groups fought to desegregate the South and end disenfranchising practices. In 1950, fed up with overcrowded, poorly funded, inferior schools, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which had put in decades of work fighting racial segregation in education, put together its most compelling legal case against racial segregation in public schools. Brown versus Board of Education. Brown v. Board was actually a grouping of 5 cases that all challenged the claim that it was constitutional for public schools to be racially segregated by law. The effort was led by lawyer Thurgood Marshall, who argued that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in agreement with Marshall, legally ending racial segregation in schools and overruling the doctrine established by Plessy. While this was a big victory for civil rights advocates, in reality, it did little to end school segregation right away, due to resistance from racist whites who didn't want their children to go to school with black children. Meanwhile, resistance was also mounting against segregated seating on public transportation, a fight brought to prominence by the actions of Rosa Parks, an African-American seamstress and civil rights activist, in 1955 when she refused to give up her seat in the colored section of a Montgomery, Alabama bus to a white man. Parks was arrested and fined, but her actions inspired local black leaders to organize the Montgomery bus boycott, led by a young Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. During the boycott, 40,000 African Americans, who made up the majority of the city bus's riders, refused to ride the buses in protest of how they were treated. Initially, their demands were simply for courtesy, the hiring of black drivers, and a first-come, first-seated policy with whites entering from the bus's front doors and blacks from the rear doors, as was custom. However, over the course of the protest, which lasted over a year, the goals changed to having the segregated seating policy totally abolished. On June 5, 1956, a Montgomery federal court ruled that any law requiring racially segregated seating on buses violated the Constitution's 14th Amendment, and the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision after the city appealed. The city's buses were integrated December 21, 1956, and the boycott ended. It had lasted more than a year and is regarded as the first large-scale demonstration against racial segregation in the U.S. Civil rights advocates were obtaining victories, but the road towards equality was a difficult one. The buses may have been integrated, but the bus stops remained segregated, and the new laws were met with significant resistance and violence. In one instance, snipers shot into a bus and shattered both legs of a pregnant African-American rider. In January 1957, 4 black churches, as well as the homes of several prominent black leaders in the Montgomery area, were bombed. In 1956, a group of Southern senators and congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto, which declared they would resist racial integration by all lawful means. After the decision in Brown v. Board, state and local officials in a number of southern states resisted school integration, and members of the public fought back as well. When 9 African-American students attempted to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, in September 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus ordered the state's National Guard to block their path on the first day of school, September 2nd. 2 days later, a belligerent mob appeared in addition to the National Guard, again preventing the 9 students from attending class. By the end of the month, September 23rd, the 9 were being escorted by Little Rock police and attempting to enter the school through a side door when another angry mob appeared and tried to rush into the school after them. Fearing for the students' lives, officials sent them home. In response, President Dwight Eisenhower federalized the National Guard and sent U.S. Army troops to the scene to personally guard the students who were finally able to start attending regular classes, though they still had to endure threats and harassment. Nonviolent protests against segregation, such as sit-ins at whites-only lunch counters and the 1961 Freedom Rides, were signature methods used by civil rights activists protesting segregation in public spaces throughout the South. These demonstrations only increased during the presidency of John F. Kennedy, when hundreds of demonstrations erupted across the nation, drawing national and international news coverage, as well as backlash and violence. The Freedom Riders, who were interracial members of the student activist group Congress for Racial Equality, CORE, met significant opposition when they challenged segregation on interstate buses and bus terminals by riding from Washington, D.C. to Jackson, Mississippi. Though a federal ruling in 1946 had already declared that segregation in interstate transport was illegal, they faced resistance and arrests in Virginia and violent beatings in South Carolina, and were met by a violent mob of over 100 people, including hostile members of the local police and members of the Ku Klux Klan, when they reached Anniston, Alabama. The violence that occurred there prompted organizers to end the ride, though efforts continued on a smaller scale. The media attention garnered by these efforts, as well as Dr. King serving as spokesman for the rides as they rose to national prominence, prompted the Kennedy administration to take action, directing the Interstate Commerce Commission to ban segregation in all buses and facilities it oversaw. The ruling took effect November 1, 1961. Though King did not take part in the rides himself, the rides are credited with showing him and others involved in the campaign that nonviolent, peaceful protest against the violence of white Southerners could garner significant national media attention, attract sympathy for the cause, and force federal action. In the spring of 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Dr. King, launched a large-scale campaign of sit-ins, meetings, boycotts of segregated stores, and marches in Birmingham, Alabama to protest segregation there in partnership with the local activist group, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, ACMHR. Activists registered people to vote, listened to speeches by King about the philosophy of nonviolence, and staged sit-ins. The boycotts of local businesses were particularly effective as they were taking place right before Easter, the second busiest shopping time of the year. Hundreds were arrested, filling the local jails. After about a week, the city government obtained a state court order that said the protests must stop, but the activists decided to defy it. The efforts continued on May 2nd when more than 1,000 African American students marched in downtown Birmingham in what became known as the Children's Crusade. Hundreds more were arrested, overcrowding the jails. The city's Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull O'Connor, authorized the use of high-pressure hoses against children protesters. And when adults watching reacted by throwing rocks and bottles at those wielding the hoses, Connor ordered the use of police dogs against them. Images of the violence triggered outrage nationally and internationally. Under pressure, the White House sent a facilitator to help speed negotiations between protest leaders and members of Birmingham's business community, who were weakening under the sustained boycott. On May 8th, the group struck a compromise. Street protests would end immediately, and signs proclaiming whites only and blacks only on restrooms and drinking fountains would be removed. The Birmingham Truce also called for the release of jailed protesters on bond, a plan to desegregate lunch counters, and the hiring of more African Americans for jobs around the city. It was not everything the protesters had hoped to achieve, but rather a partial success that proved divisive among activists who thought the protesters should have held out until all their goals were met. The city was slowly desegregated in the months that followed the truce, but the campaign was not a huge local success. Rather, its significance was in the amount of national and international attention it drew to the civil rights cause. It also led King's reputation as a leader to grow exponentially. On August 28th, King delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which was organized in the nation's capital to advocate for African American civil and economic rights. It is estimated that 250,000 people attended, making the assembly, which was planned in cooperation with DC police, a logistical feat. The march sought to address the fact that many jobs were entirely closed to black applicants, and those that were open to them often paid poorly or offered little upward mobility. The year 1963 was the centennial anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the declaration of the end of slavery, and organizers of the march wished to emphasize that change was long overdue. The march brought together many different activists and organizers, but it was King's speech at the Lincoln Memorial that was memorialized as a masterpiece of rhetoric, as it called for an end to racism. The march and the speech are credited with inspiring the federal government to act on civil rights through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations, public education, and employment, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting. These were the two most important pieces of civil rights legislation to be passed since the Reconstruction period, and brought many of the Jim Crow policies to an end. No conflict was more representative of the US's Cold War commitment to getting involved in elective fights with communist governments, even under unfavorable circumstances, than the Vietnam War, led by the strongly anti-communist politician Ngo Dinh Diem, who was nevertheless a repressive dictator who called for the arrest and torture of suspected communist sympathizers. The South Vietnamese fought the communist North Vietnamese for control of the country. In 1964, under President Lyndon Johnson, the U.S. began regular air raids of North Vietnamese targets, dropping bombs in a program known as Operation Rolling Thunder. Between 1964 to 1973, the U.S. also secretly dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on North Vietnamese supply lines in neighboring Laos, despite the country being neutral in the conflict. In 1965, Johnson called for a significant increase in American troops deployed to Vietnam. By June 1965, 82,000 combat troops were stationed in Vietnam. At the end of July, 100,000 troops were sent, and another 100,000 were sent in 1966. South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand also sent troops, but in much smaller numbers. North Vietnam was aided by China and the Soviet Union. By November 1967, the number of American troops in Vietnam was approaching 500,000, but support for the unsuccessful war was waning. A strong anti-war movement in the U.S. spawned protests against the draft, the large number of civilian casualties the war was generating, and against the U.S.'s support for the corrupt Southern Vietnamese dictatorship. Many troops stationed in Vietnam were also low on morale, with many turning to drugs, initiating mutinies, and developing post-traumatic stress disorder. Between 1966 and 1973, more than 503,000 U.S. military personnel deserted, and another 500,000 dodged the draft. Nevertheless, when President Nixon took office, he announced that he believed a silent majority of Americans supported the war. Over the next few years, the death toll grew, including the more than 400 unarmed civilian U.S. troops killed in the village of My Lai in 1968. Peace talks were unsuccessful. Anti-war sentiment in the U.S. only increased. Over 250,000 people gathered to demonstrate against the war in Washington, D.C. on November 15, 1969. Nixon ended the draft in 1972, moving to an all-volunteer army. But in 1971, the leaked Pentagon Papers had revealed the results of a secret DoD study that showed Nixon's administration had escalated conflict in Vietnam, further eroding public support for the war. In January 1973, the United States and North Vietnam ended open hostilities, though conflict between North and South Vietnam continued until 1975, when the North took over the southern city of Saigon. The U.S.'s effort had failed, and the 20-year war took an enormous toll. An estimated 2 million Vietnamese were killed, while 3 million were wounded and another 12 million became refugees. About 58,000 Americans were killed. Many anti-war Americans lost trust in their government, while others who may have been pro-war no longer felt invincible. The conflict bitterly divided the U.S., and its impacts would be felt for many years. Following the end of World War II in 1946, tensions rose between the capitalistic United States and the communist Soviet Union. Each country wished to prove its economic system to be better than the other, and to show the world they had the key to political superiority. Both countries sought to demonstrate their technological superiority by being the first nation to put a human being into space, which at the time was an as-yet undone feat that each knew was only a few years away. Both countries had developed intercontinental missiles, which provided critical electronic technology and rocketry that could boost small payloads into orbit. The competition began on August 2, 1955, when first the US, then the USSR announced they intended to launch artificial satellites. 2 years later, on October 4, 1957, the USSR was the first to launch its satellite, the Sputnik 1, which was the first Earth-orbiting satellite in history. They followed up with the Sputnik 2 the next month, and this time the satellite carried a dog named Laika, who became the first living organism to enter orbit. It was not until the following January 31, 1958, that the US entered the race by launching and reaching orbit with the satellite Explorer 1. Later that year, the US created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, an independent agency within the federal government that is responsible for the civil space program, aeronautics programs, and space research. On December 18, 1958, the US launched the world's first communications satellite, known as SCORE. It earned international attention when it broadcasted a pre-recorded Christmas message from US President Dwight D. Eisenhower. It was the first instance of a human voice being broadcast from space. In August 1959, the US launched Explorer 6, the world's first weather satellite. It took the first picture of the Earth from space. In September, the USSR launched Luna 2, which became the first spacecraft to reach the surface of the Moon. But these unmanned missions were just the beginning. In August 1960, the USSR's Sputnik 5 was the first spacecraft to return its contents: 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, and some plants, alive after being in space. The US matches this achievement the following year, returning Ham, a chimpanzee, alive from space. While the first 5 years of the space race demonstrated mostly matched capability, the USSR took a marked lead on April 12, 1961, when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, traveling aboard the Vostok 1, became the first human being to reach space. Gagarin made a single orbit around the Earth, which took just under 2 hours to complete. This milestone sent the competition into a new decade with increased vigor. In September 1962, US President John F. Kennedy announced that the US would land people on the Moon and return them safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This speech is largely remembered for his declaration, "We choose to go to the Moon." More and more people, both members of the government and members of private industry, became involved in the US space race, reflecting the intensity of the competition, with numbers growing from 36,000 people involved in 1960 to 377,000 by 1965. In May 1961, the US launched Alan Shepard aboard the Mercury Redstone 3. And while Shepard became the first American to visit space, he was not able to enter orbit. The flight lasted only about 15 minutes. In the following years, the Soviet Union replicated its victories, sending the first woman to space in 1963. Valentina Tereshkova orbited the Earth for 3 days aboard Vostok 6, and pioneering the first spacewalk when cosmonaut Alexei Leonov left his spacecraft for 12 minutes in 1965. While the USSR took a clear lead in manned missions, the US secured another achievement with its satellite program. On July 14, 1965, the American satellite Mariner 4 was the first to voyage to Mars and take close-up images of the planet's surface. The US did not give up on manned missions despite tragedy. In January 1967, 3 American astronauts died when a fire broke out inside their capsule while it was still on the launch pad. At the end of the following year, however, the US spacecraft Apollo 8 became the first manned craft to reach the Moon, orbit it, and then return to the Earth. This victory showed the US it was time to move full speed ahead on missions to the Moon. The next year, in July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the Moon. The televised landing by Apollo 11 was broadcast around the world, securing for the US what people saw as victory in the space race. The Soviet Union transferred its focus to building a space station, which it completed in 1971. In 1972, the US and the Soviet Union negotiated a warming of relations, which paved the way for cooperation in the realm of space travel. In 1975, the first joint space mission between the two countries occurred. Separately, the Apollo and Soyuz spacecrafts traveled into orbit and docked in space, where their two commanders shook hands. This was a symbolic end to the space race. After it occurred, the two countries engaged in future missions together, like the Shuttle Mir program in 1993. The space race had broader implications for the world beyond just the development of spaceflight technology. The race to send humans to space resulted in the development of other widely used technology, including communication and weather satellites, which are used today for things like broadband and GPS. The imaging technology used in CAT scans was initially developed during the space race for deep space photography. NASA also made innovations in shock-absorbent material, which became useful for developing better artificial limbs, and wireless headsets were first developed for astronauts to use in space. In response to the catastrophes brought on by totalitarian ideologies in the 20th century, a new school of thought began in the 1970s known as postmodernism. Postmodernism was deeply skeptical of the claim that there was any kind of universal truth, instead focusing on relative truths and morals. The postmodernist period coincided with a cultural shift that occurred as the baby boomers came of age. During the 1970s, these young people continued movements that had begun in the 1960s, demonstrating against the policies and schools of thought of the previous age. Thousands of students marched against the Vietnam War and the draft, as well as against the manufacturer of napalm, Dow Chemical. Not all campus anti-war protests were peaceful. Some turned violent, including the May 1970 incident at Kent State University in Ohio, in which 13 students were shot by members of the National Guard. During this time, people also protested against discrimination against women, racial segregation, and other issues. The very first Earth Day was observed on April 22, 1970. Television and radio were ubiquitous, with such shows as All in the Family, Saturday Night Live, and Wheel of Fortune premiering. This decade also saw the launch of the first successful home video game system, the Atari 2600, and the founding of tech companies Apple and Microsoft. At the same time, the US was in a recession and gas prices were skyrocketing due to the Arab oil embargo, which was inflicted on the countries who had supported Israel in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. The US also faced political turmoil as illegal activities committed in the name of re-electing President Richard Nixon came to light in the Watergate scandal and caused the downfall of Nixon's presidency. The legacy of Watergate deeply damaged the Republican Party's reputation, so Democrat Jimmy Carter was able to win the presidency in 1976. Carter prioritized calming conflicts around the world, signing a nuclear arms reduction treaty with the Soviet Union and giving ownership of the Panama Canal back to Panama. Most notably, he helped broker peace in the Middle East, where conflict had been ongoing since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But Carter's support for the Shah of Iran, who wanted to modernize and westernize Iran, soon became a point of contention. By 1979, the Shah had lost popularity and was overthrown, at which time anti-American sentiment increased in the country. A group overthrew the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage for the next 444 days. In the aftermath of this Iran hostage crisis, a second energy crisis developed, sending gasoline prices soaring again. In the presidential election of 1980, Ronald Reagan defeated Carter in a landslide. In the 1980s, social issues took a back seat, and personal financial success became many people's primary goal. The populist conservative movement known as the New Right had begun growing in the late 70s into the early 80s. Reagan advocated for deregulating business, reducing government spending, and giving tax cuts to both individuals and corporations. The tax cut plan was part of a system known as supply-side economics, or the belief that the resulting gains for businesses would eventually trickle down to everyone. Altogether, these economic policies were known as Reaganomics. In 1982, the United States experienced its worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. 9 million people were unemployed in November of that year. Nevertheless, Reaganomics remained popular as it made the rich richer. Over the 1980s, the average income of families in the wealthiest 1% increased significantly, and at a much greater rate than the income of middle-class families, which edged up mildly, while income for the bottom 40% of families declined. Television had entered nearly every household and was becoming more varied, with shows like Cheers, The Simpsons, and The Cosby Show premiering. Also popular was TV news, which brought new levels of attention to crimes, like child abduction via shows like 60 Minutes. People also learned about tragedies around the world, such as the famine in Ethiopia. The Live Aid benefit concert on July 13, 1985 was watched by about 1.5 billion people and raised millions of dollars for famine relief. In 1986, viewers could watch the local Cleveland, Ohio chapter of the United Way attempt to break the world record for most balloons released at one time. But the event, intended as a harmless publicity stunt, quickly went off the rails. A colorful cloud of 1.5 million helium-filled balloons was released, but blown by wind and pushed down by rain, they caused an airport to shut down and impeded the Coast Guard's efforts to find 2 fishermen who needed help nearby. The balloons clogged waterways and caused traffic accidents and came to be seen as a major environmental disaster. The U.S. returned to space in 1981 with the Space Shuttle Columbia, the very first reusable space exploration vehicle. The U.S. flew numerous shuttle missions in the 80s, though one was marked by tragedy. Millions watched live in 1986 when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded seconds after takeoff, killing all 7 aboard. This grounded the space program for 2.5 years, until the Discovery was launched in 1988. Reagan's foreign policy was hawkish, and that he was eager to get the U.S. involved in situations abroad where communism threatened to take over. Under this Reagan doctrine, the U.S. provided financial and military assistance to the governments of Grenada, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. However, in 1986, it was revealed that the U.S. had sold weapons to Iran despite the country being under an arms embargo, which was a sanction imposed in retribution for the storming of the U.S. Embassy in 1979. Members of the Reagan administration sold Iran the arms in a bid to illegally divert money from the sales to a rebel group known as the Contras, who were fighting the Socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. It was a scandal for the administration, and investigations into the issue were impeded because of the large number of documents that were shredded or withheld. Several administration officials were convicted of crimes related to the Iran-Contra scandal, but all were vacated or pardoned. Another Reagan administration scandal emerged later after review of its response to the 1980s AIDS crisis. Though health officials in the U.S. had become aware of the AIDS virus in 1981, U.S. leaders remained silent over the early days of the epidemic. Not until 1985, when AIDS had already affected more than 7,700 people and killed 3,500, did the government allocate funding for AIDS research. And it was not until 1987 that the federal government began raising AIDS awareness. But by then, about 47,000 Americans already were infected with HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. The issue had largely been dismissed because it was believed to only be affecting sexually active gay men. But during the 1980s, AIDS emerged as a leading cause of death among all young adults. By 1990, more than 100,000 people in the U.S. had died from AIDS. Getting much more federal attention was an epidemic of a different kind: drugs. Smokable, solid chunks of crack cocaine were cheap and highly available in major U.S. cities in 1985. Crack particularly affected low-income communities living in cities, which included large numbers of African Americans. Drug dealers contributed to a significant increase in violence in these communities. Between 1984 and 1989, the homicide rate for young black men more than doubled, and black communities also saw increases in fetal death rates, low birth weight babies, weapons arrests, and the number of children in foster care. In 1986, the U.S. Congress passed laws that made penalties for the possession or trafficking of crack cocaine 100 times more severe than for powdered cocaine, which was widely believed to be targeting low-income African Americans who were more likely to be using cheap crack rather than the more expensive powder or other drugs like crystal methamphetamine. This resulted in harsh social consequences, including increased police brutality against African Americans and large numbers of young black men imprisoned on drug convictions for long sentences, which then caused them to lose access to voting, housing, and employment opportunities, which in turn led to increased violent crime in poor black communities. Though President Nixon began the so-called war on drugs in the 1970s, the federal effort to stop drug use and to prosecute users was widely expanded under President Reagan. Whereas Nixon's programs had repealed minimum sentences for marijuana possession and set up federal drug treatment programs, Reagan's approach was to increase criminalization. In 1984, Reagan signed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which expanded the federal penalties for possession, cultivation, or transfer of marijuana, established minimum sentences, and abolished parole for federal prisoners. From 1980 to 1984, the federal annual budget of the FBI's drug enforcement units went from $8 million to $95 million. When George H.W. Bush took over the presidency in 1989, he continued Reagan's efforts. In his very first televised address as president, Bush held up a plastic baggie filled with white, chalky chunks, identifying it as crack cocaine. "It's as innocent looking as candy, but it's turning our cities into battle zones," he said. Drug use was actually in decline by 1989, but Bush went on to spend $45 billion, mostly on drug-related law enforcement, which was more than the previous 4 administrations combined. Later, it was revealed that the baggie from Bush's speech, supposedly confiscated from a drug bust just days prior, just steps from the White House in Lafayette Park, had been a setup. An undercover federal agent had lured a teenager drug dealer to the park before busting him to make it seem like the drug trade was on the president's doorstep. Another major event of Bush's presidency was the Gulf War. Under the rule of Saddam Hussein, Iraq wanted to nationalize Kuwait and take control of its oil fields, thereby controlling a significant amount of the world's oil supply. Because the US and other countries wanted to maintain access to these fields, they formed a coalition to stop the invasion. Starting January 16, 1991, an air and ground war was fought with soldiers from the US, the UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Kuwait. The Iraqi army was defeated handily, retreating from Kuwait just a month later on February 28th. The conflict's impacts were felt into the 21st century. Between 1990 and 1997, the percentage of households in the United States owning computers increased from 15% to 35%. This widespread adoption of personal computers and the World Wide Web catapulted the information technology industry into the stratosphere, and investors and entrepreneurs everywhere were looking for ways to get a piece of the pie. By 1998, lured by the potential profitability of online businesses, low interest rates, and the availability of venture capital, investors were eager to back nearly any company with a .com in its name, while ignoring traditional predictors of success. That is, the ability to turn a profit, or even a business plan of any kind. At the height of the boom, even companies that had never made any revenue were able to go public by issuing an initial public offering, or IPO, and raise money. On paper, some people became millionaires practically overnight. The Nasdaq Composite Index, one of the most watched stock market metrics, rose by 582% from January 1995 to March 2000. The situation was risky, however, because these companies were highly overvalued due to their lack of a plan to turn a profit. Analysts were instead focused on their ability to attract internet traffic. Speculation, or the purchase of risky stocks at a low price with the expectation that the price will rise enough to make a later profit, the dot-com speculation bubble was just a house of cards. When investment capital began to dry up, many of the companies that had caused so much excitement went bankrupt, and the bubble burst. Market panic resulted in massive sell-offs, and by 2002, investor losses from the dot-com boom were estimated at around $5 trillion. The dot-com bubble's bursting is credited with helping to trigger an 8-month economic recession starting in March 2001. However, the recession is considered one of the milder ones in the country's history, and not all of the companies of the dot-com era succumbed to bankruptcy. Some of those that survived became the juggernauts we're familiar with today, such as Microsoft, Amazon, eBay, Qualcomm, and Cisco. After a record-breaking turnout, Barack Obama was the first ever African American to be voted to the office of U.S. President, winning the popular vote by more than 10 million votes and securing a vast majority of electoral votes. Obama's message was hope, and it resonated with the American people. As the War of Terror raged on, economic difficulties on the home front compounded the feelings of insecurity. In 2008, losses on a rapidly declining housing market within the U.S. caused a chain reaction of losses across the global financial market, causing a massive and sustained economic contraction known as the Great Recession. The recession marked the most significant economic downturn in the U.S. since the Great Depression of 1929. Thousands of Americans could not make their loan payments and lost their homes, businesses went bankrupt, and the U.S. government scrambled to help alleviate the damage. In 2009, under the direction of newly elected President Barack Obama, the Congress passed a series of acts to alleviate the issues caused by the recession and to install reforms to ensure it could never happen again. In 2013, the Afghan military officially took over control of operations in their country, and the U.S. announced a timetable for a complete U.S. withdrawal by 2016. During the election of 2016, Republican nominee Donald Trump and Democrat Hillary Clinton faced off in one of the ugliest elections the country had ever experienced. While Clinton ran on her vast experience within the federal government, Trump's campaign was unlike any that had been run before. Trump appealed to a group of Americans who had never felt they'd been marginalized in recent years, and to people who had distrust in the government. Clinton was defeated by Trump, who secured the majority of electoral votes. Almost immediately, suspicion of Russian and Chinese involvement in tampering with the election arose. In 2017, President Donald Trump took office and reversed the planned withdrawal as an emerging terrorist organization known as the Islamic State began operating within Afghanistan. Trump authorized the use of the U.S.'s largest non-nuclear bomb in an act which coincided with his decision to continue the U.S.'s military presence on the ground. After another 2 years of conflict, the U.S. and Taliban once again opened peace negotiations. And after a series of back-and-forth cancellations, an agreement was at last reached in 2020. In early 2020, a new type of virus emerged from Wuhan, China. By mid-March 2020, all 50 U.S. states had reported at least one positive case of COVID-19, and nearly all of the new infections were caused by community spread, and not by contracting the disease abroad. The COVID-19 pandemic took a heavy toll on Americans economically, politically, and psychologically, and revealed deep divisions between Americans' views of the role of government in a crisis, particularly with regard to vaccine mandates. In 2020, the nation again faced a challenging and incendiary election. Incumbent Donald Trump, running for re-election, faced off against former Vice President Joe Biden at the height of the pandemic. Again, domestic issues of racial injustice, gun control, and appointments to the Supreme Court were the chief concerns of the race. As the ongoing health crisis further divided the parties, the psychological and physical toll of the pandemic became a centerpiece for both candidates. After a contentious election, during which the counting lasted longer than normal due to early election and mail-in ballots prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic, Biden won the presidency, winning the majority of electoral votes as well as the popular vote. The outcome of the election was immediately contested by Trump and the Republicans who made claims of fraud. Trump would claim repeatedly that the election was stolen and increased distrust in the American electoral process. On January 6, 2021, as the U.S. Congress met to certify the election, large crowds of Trump supporters led by the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, both far-right anti-government extremist organizations with ties to white supremacist organizations, the groups conspired to take the U.S. Capitol building and force the Congress to certify the election as fraudulent and instate Trump as the rightful president. On January 6th, the mob outside of the Capitol building breached through security and entered the Capitol, forcing the Congress to flee and Capitol Police to engage with force in some cases. When the police had at last cleared the building, counting of the electoral votes resumed, and Vice President Pence proclaimed Biden the winner. In 2021, Joe Biden assumed the office of the presidency alongside Vice President Kamala Harris, the first African American and first woman to hold the office. Under President Joe Biden, the U.S. military at last began its final withdrawal from Afghanistan. As it did, the Taliban quickly rushed to fill the gap and toppled the fragile Afghan government, undoing the work that was done for the last 20 years. The following year, 2022, the Russian Federation invaded the Republic of Ukraine, and the United States began funneling aid to the country to combat Russia's expansion into the region. Today, Biden's administration continues to push for progressive policies, both at home and abroad, and still combats the intense political division within the country. As the 2024 election looms, the future of the United States seems to hang in the balance. Since the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the nation has endured substantial and often violent changes politically, socially, and economically. But this is, in and of itself, the defining attribute of the United States, that despite the trials and tribulations, she always emerges intact and stronger than before. The beauty of the United States and its people is their resilience and its ability to adapt and change. Today, the United States remains a world leader to be respected and admired. Its population of more than 334 million people is one of the most diverse countries in the world. Its landscape is painted with some of the most magnificent natural features on the planet, with hundreds of recognized national and historical parks, preserves, monuments, and sites preserved by the federal government. From the humblest beginnings, the people of the United States of America have fought for what they believed was right and continue to do so to this day. The indomitable American spirit which characterizes the best of Americans has helped bring the country to new heights in the realm of politics, science, business, and culture. And while they're far from perfect, the American people continue to strive for greatness, never ceasing to prove themselves worthy of the great experiment started by their revolution nearly 250 years ago.